Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Ovais Anwar. Pakistan produces less than 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we face some of the most devastating climate consequences on Earth. Tonight, we ask a simple question. What does justice look like when you're not the one who started the fire, but you're certainly the one that feels the heat? To answer this, my guest is someone who needs no introduction, Ahmed Rafay Alam, environmental lawyer, activist, and founding partner of Salim Alam & Co. Rafi, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Miss.
Rafi, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of this cosmic farce, this irony that we are part of, that's being played on Pakistan? We contribute so little to, global emissions, and yet, we reap so much of the harm.
Yeah.
What really do you make of this when it comes to Pakistan and our predicament?
Well, this formulation actually originates from the Pakistan climate policy of 2012. Pakistan was one of the first developing countries to adopt a climate policy. And somewhere in one of the chapters, it talks about how Pakistan is a small net greenhouse gas emitter, yet is very vulnerable, in sort of justifying an argument for climate change and also pointing out the larger climate injustices involved. But I mean, the truth is that there are many other, especially small island states, Vanuatu, the Maldives, that are far more vulnerable in the same sort of index as Pakistan because their populations are smaller, far less emissions, and much graver existential threat. I mean, the Maldives will eventually sink. And so this is in many ways sort of a way of portraying climate injustice and bringing the argument to the world on how climate injustice plays out. But the truth is, there's no country on earth that isn't affected by climate change, right? And no country on earth that is equally vulnerable. It's just that some are richer than others. And this is just the way Pakistan positions itself for these sorts of things.
Absolutely. No, that's very helpful. We're hearing, especially when the Republican Party wins, slogans like "drill, baby, drill," and we have these climate change deniers. We have Donald Trump, taking decisions where they're affecting your and our lives. How do you, as an environmental lawyer in Pakistan, grapple with the climate change deniers who are taking these monumental decisions affecting our lives?
Grapple. I don't necessarily grapple with them. But the way I look at this, let me give you a scenario, right? There are some calculations, for example, that say that between moving from 1.5 degrees of global warming compared to pre-industrial levels to 2 degrees of global warming will involve the production of greenhouse gases and air pollution associated with them. And just the air pollution involved in moving from 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade of global warming, according to one study, is about 150 million deaths caused by respiratory failure associated with automobile and energy emissions. Now, that is a staggering amount. 150 million, just to give that context, it is
that's a genocide.
It is. I'll come to that. It is 4 times the number of soldiers killed in World War I and World War II put together.
Wow.
It is an immense amount. And by the way, when you look at air pollution hotspots around the world, air pollution is not equally distributed. Air pollution hotspots are Asian and African cities. So China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, countries in between, and then countries in Central Africa. And so most of these 150 million people will be us.
Absolutely.
People in less developed countries. And so when I see global north politicians from more developed countries, especially ones with cleaner air, deny air pollution, they're in effect denying this genocide that you said was going to occur. And it makes me understand this a little bit better because global north politicians like Donald Trump respond to their own political constituencies.
Yeah.
And right now, with climate and global warming exceeding 1.5 this year, right? This is now the 3rd successive year surface temperatures have exceeded 1.5, and projections are that we'll breach 2 degrees by 2050.
Wow.
It seems that the political constituencies in the global north are willing to absorb a genocide.
Wow.
because
That's quite the statement there. Yeah.
their politicians don't need to stick their head out and say, look, 150 million people in the global south is too much. You folks need to stop driving your SUVs and consuming so much, etc., etc., etc. Nobody is saying that. So it's beyond climate denialism. It infuriates me that global north politicians play this game because
Mm.
they're playing games with our lives, literally.
Absolutely. No, it's the way you've encapsulated that really makes it, brings it home, especially for us. But just a follow-up question on that. How do we make them realize? How we've had some of the best advocates have been the youth.
Um, don't put everything on the shoulders of the youth. It's kind of like saying trees will clean the air. There's a limited amount of things a tree can do, and there's a
Hmm.
limited. No, what do you need to do? Broadly speaking, we need to recognize firstly that climate change is not necessarily a problem. It is a symptom of a problem. It is a symptom of overconsumption based on an global economic system that prioritizes profit over the unaccountable exploitation of nature and human resources. So, if you can exploit people and resources to generate money and satisfy your shareholders, we live in an economic system that is perfectly fine with that. We live in a system where there is still not just colonial, but post colonial and imperial economic hegemony that extracts resources from the global south and pollutes the global south for the profit of the global north. These are the drivers, these are the real problems. So, what are we to do? Well, we need to retool the global economic system. We need to retool and address colonialism and post colonialism. We need to address consumerism around the world because it isn't just about countries producing greenhouse gases. Within countries, for example, in Pakistan, the richest people in Pakistan consume the same or have the same carbon footprint as some of the middle class and upper middle class people in the global north. So, on the scale of affluence, people with wealth have to change their behaviors, be less consumerist, rely less on this economic system. And it's this sort of change. And it's not just me. A few years ago, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said that the earth needs to have a profound change in its economic and social systems. In other words, a new sort of morality. It
Hmm.
needs to be calculated because this type of overconsumption it has destroyed the Earth's resources and has brought us to a precipice of civilizational collapse.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, just to bring this a little bit, closer to home. I think a year or two ago, you in an interview to NPR, you mentioned that Lahore's become unlivable, that the air quality just keeps on getting worse over the past decade, which is certainly a tragedy. Now, for someone who's dedicated their life really to and their career to this fight, and um, it becomes and I ask this from a personal perspective as well. There's a number of initiatives that I'm working on that you seem like you're against these insurmountable odds at times. How do you hold on to a sense of purpose? How do you you know continue the hope when the crisis is just deteriorating in front of you?
Well, you know, I consider myself an activist, even though I have white hair. And at this age, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. Activists should be young people. Um, but I've learned many things in different forms of activism that I've taken, varying forms of failure. Um, I've learned many things, but one of the most profound was taught to me by my mentor and late friend, the great Ardeshir Kausji, the columnist
Absolutely.
in Dawn,
Yeah.
who campaigned, of course, in the 90s against much of the urbanization in Karachi, some of the development in Karachi and so on, and was
Hmm.
very effective in court and set up some of the earlier precedents on environmental law in Pakistan. He once told me that activism is not about winning, it's about the fight itself, right?
Wow.
And so that's what we do. We believe in some principles, and that's we're in it for the fight. It's not about the victory at all.
Wow.
And so
That's
you don't take it
yeah.
personally. You don't take it, it just you. These are the values you have, and these are the values you wish to sort of propagate, and you fight for them.
Yeah, I mean, earlier when you mentioned, that they try to write away the genocide that they're doing in our part of the world, in our neck of the woods, it's difficult to not take that personally at times. But I do understand your point, and I do understand, where you develop that, um, get that, momentum or that energy to move on. Um, You've said, in another interview that I was reading when preparing for this, that ultimately, what can a court of law do about climate change, right? That seemed a bit defeatist to me, but the point that you were raising was that, can you file a writ petition against the monsoon? And so, looking at it from an environmental lawyer's perspective, are courts honest, effective tools for climate change? For climate justice, sorry, and or are this merely like a pressure valve that we're utilizing in Pakistan to get rid of some of this pent up energy that happens, and we see the deteriorating situation around us, whether it's the water table or whether it's air quality or a number of other issues.
How, well, you see, the courts of law in Pakistan are based on the English colonial model. We have inherited a
Absolutely.
system, right? And if you go into the history of how courts developed in what's now the United Kingdom, you'll see that the courts of law around the world that follow the common law system, this is all part of what has developed since the nation state took vogue after the Treaty of Habsburg somewhere in the late
Mm-hmm.
1700s. We moved from monarchies and royalty into the system of a head of state being supported by a democratically elected representative body with a judiciary, the three sort of pillars of state, having a separate state bank, a free press, are all sort of models that derive from this. And this all comes back to how the nation state was set up. So, our judicial processes that we inherited from the British have foundations in how the nation state came to be and the issues and problems faced by those countries as they were developing into nation states. And the judiciary really was and has been, and really to a large extent, even though the Pakistani judiciary has many distinctive characteristics, it still
Mm-hmm.
continues to be at its essence an institution that protects private property rights. That's what judiciaries do. They adjudicate cases between individuals and
Yeah.
determine what the law is. And in this framework, climate justice is unworkable. It was never a consideration when the nation state was being formulated. And so the design of our courts doesn't really look into externalities that we consider externalities like the environment or climate. It's always about the two parties or the several parties in front of the bench. And so, in many ways, the design of the judiciary is incapable of dealing with an existential threat like climate change, which transcends the nation state. As a matter of fact, Anthony Levin, who once wrote a book on Pakistan, he called it a hard
Hard
state.
country. Yeah.
Hard country, that's right. He's written a book on climate change and the nation state where he makes this argument that the nation state itself was designed, nation states were designed to fight each other and provide security to their citizens. They weren't designed to deal with an external threat like climate change. And so, from its very essence and its foundations, the judicial system is incapable, according to this present design, of dealing
Mm-hmm.
with something like climate injustice.
That's quite a statement coming from a lawyer, that the system we're working in is something that is simply ill-equipped to be able to deal with this thing. How do we equip it? Are
Systems
these?
can change. Absolutely, systems have changed. Systems
They
can
have,
change.
no doubt. Yeah.
You know, I think it's impractical to think that courts of law will clean water or that courts of law will clean air. No court of law has cleaned air, right? They can
Mm-hmm.
adjudicate between individuals and individual rights. They can set out penalties in criminal cases, but to expect them to clean air, again, is like expecting trees to do the same thing. They're not designed to do so. What ultimately works is redesigning the system, and that can be done only through legislation. We can have legislation that recognizes the environment as a party in cases. We can have, for
Wow.
example, legislation that gives rights to rivers so that if there's pollution in the Indus can be represented by local communities who can then sue other people. I mean, these are design elements that you can introduce into your system and change them so that the system becomes more adept at dealing with something as complex as climate justice. So, yes, there is an opportunity to do so, but legislation only really comes when the constituencies within that country demand for it. right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
in present day Pakistan, I don't see a constituency right now, or at least the dominant constituencies, begging for something like climate justice.
But Rafi, I mean, are people, is it due to disenfranchisement? Is it, I mean, when a third of your country is underwater, do these people not feel affected that, go approach court, go try to, exercise your rights? Or are we so deprived of this development of rights in this area that, sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
I mean, look, the 2022 floods and last year's floods, again, we have so many examples, 2010 floods,
Yeah,
16 floods, 2022 floods. Um, it rained over parts of Balochistan and Sindh during August and September of 2022, and we're talking 400 to 800% of monthly averages falling in a matter of weeks.
absolutely.
And so much so that there was a 100-kilometer lake that developed because a lot of this rainfall occurred in parts of Sindh and Balochistan that don't drain to the Indus. And you could see this lake from a satellite, right?
Yeah.
Um, what court of law, what legal remedy, what statute gives any citizen the ability to do something in those circumstances, right? So climate justice works on different scales.
Hmm.
Courts of law might not be able to operate at the domestic scale because a 100-kilometer lake, there's no legislation, no precedent to be able to deal with
Yeah.
it. But at the international level, by the way, there was a study conducted by Imperial College London in about November, October of 2022 that suggested that over 50% of the intensity of the rainfall in Sindh and Balochistan in August and September was caused by the 1 degree centigrade global warming that we've experienced. In other words, that rainfall was not a natural occurrence. It was a man-made occurrence on account of greenhouse gases produced by the global north since the Industrial Revolution. And Pakistanis were forced to foot the bill for the lifestyle and profits made by the global north. Now, there should be remedies there. That's another aspect of climate justice or injustice, right? There should be international courts where you can go and say, with this new, better science that we have, attribution science, go and say that this loss was caused by you. I mean, there's still
Hmm.
many more questions to answer in that. For example, if Pakistan were to go to some imaginary legal forum and say the global north is guilty for greenhouse gases. Well, what mathematical formula are you going to use to distinguish European countries and their emissions and America and its emissions in terms of just how bad the impacts in Pakistan were? So climate justice is not easy. There aren't any international forums where such complaints can be taken, right? What we
Hmm.
do have is an international treaty where countries try and come together with the objective of stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions. But right now, especially after the Paris Agreement, it's all a voluntary arrangement. That
That's
said, there are some groups and entities that are seeking to introduce ecocide as a crime against humanity in the International Criminal Court. That might change the game a little bit, right? When you can go and say, I mean, pardon me, my French, but CPEC is planning to build a highway through the Hindu Kush Karakoram Himalayan mountain ranges, some of the most vulnerable glacial areas on the face of the earth, and they're going to
yeah.
put 1,000 diesel trucks on that. Now,
Hmm.
one could argue, that
Yeah.
this would be a type of ecocide, or a type of a crime against humanity. Similarly, the bombing of Iran wantonly and the use of all these bombardments and chemical weapons is also a form of ecocide. So perhaps those groups can become a little bit more effective, and perhaps countries can vote to have ecocide introduced as a crime against humanity, and perhaps that will change the system. But as with anything, right, there are always complications.
No, absolutely, and you've really picked on a point where, when it comes to international law, this is perhaps its weakest element: enforcement, right? And now, ecocide and certainly crimes against humanity. This is my bread and butter. This is what I work on, and so it's always been fascinating looking at how we can bring environmental destruction into the realm of international criminal law. That way, the problem is that regular international criminal law, we've seen the past 3,
2 years,
4
yeah.
years, from Ukraine and Russia to Gaza, the type of failure, spectacular failure that international criminal law has been. We've gotten some warrants out, and they have had an impact at times, right? They have a persuasive impact, if nothing else. But really holding people accountable and holding nations accountable, I think, is one of the toughest challenges we're facing today.
Well, I share your concern because if international law can't work on a small geographic area like Gaza, how are you going to
Mm,
scale it up for the rest of the world and make it effective when we're facing a
absolutely.
civilizational collapse and a genocide as well? And so I step back. This is no, there is no easy fix, right? Under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where you're supposed to stabilize greenhouse gases, developed countries are supposed they've promised to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and also provide climate finance to less developed countries who are vulnerable so that they can prepare. And those promises have all been broken. We have not reduced greenhouse gases. As a matter of fact, in the 30 odd years since the UNFCCC was introduced, this Earth has produced more greenhouse gases than in all of human history before the UNFCCC. So there's been no stabilization whatsoever. And climate finance. I mean, in 2010, when the Conference of Parties that was signatory to the UNFCCC met in the Mexican city of Cancun, the G20 countries pledged to capitalize a global climate fund by 2020 to $100 billion. It's 2026 today, and that fund doesn't have more than $20 billion in it right now.
Wow.
Whereas a year and a half ago, the United States granted military aid to Ukraine and Israel in the tune of $90 billion in just 1 year. Right? So the promise of climate finance has been broken, the promise of mitigation has been broken, and it's countries like Pakistan that now face immense vulnerabilities and climate challenges going forward. I mean, we suffer a climate shock almost every year now. That's extremely detrimental to our economy, right? We're beginning to face it on a year-to-year basis, almost on a seasonal basis. And it's not just Pakistan. I assure you, you look
Hmm.
online, every single country is facing similar problems. And so there are no quick fixes. And I go back to my earlier statement that climate change is a symptom. It is the overconsumption based on human behavior that has led us to this point. And we need to change human behavior. And that only can be really done by retooling morality, politics, and economics. And, that takes social pressure and education and time, and who knows, perhaps a revolution or two.
Wow, absolutely. Um, Rafi, I want to come to some of the judgments, the landmark judgments that have come out of Pakistan on climate jurisprudence, Shelazia, Asghar Laghari case, and so many. They're cited globally, right?
Yes.
They're, but you've said that much of climate law and the changes that have come about here and the reform and the positivity have stemmed from a small family of practitioners, and it hasn't really branched out into the general legal community as a whole. What I wanted to ask you is when you're creating or when you're trying to lay the foundation for, say, a new area or an area of law, there's an entire ecosystem that you want to build around it, right? From law schools to legal practitioners, the courts, and certainly the litigants, the citizens who are affected most. How do we go about doing this, and how do we break that small family and make this an area of general practice?
I was inspired to start legal practice and indeed joined. I was inspired by Asma Jahangir and her human rights works. I joined her chamber as an intern when I was a law student.
Wow.
And I remember one of the cases in the Lahore High Court was what we now call an honor killing. That was, as we say in legal terms, buried by the High Court on account that it was a family affair, right? And it's betraying how old I am when I say that this was in the early 1990s.
Wow.
लाहौर हाई कोर्ट में जज ने ओपन चेंबर में कहा that this is a personal matter I'm not
Mm-hmm.
dealing with. Fast forward to 2026. Yes, we have idhar udhar ikka dukka, some black sheep, but I challenge you to find a judge in the High Court who will say that about a murder. Now, it
Never.
took
Yeah.
it took years and decades of effort in civil society, and people like Asma Jahangir and her colleagues were vilified as sort of carrying out a foreign funded agenda, facing life threats. Asma Jahangir's car was once burnt down in the parking lot of the Lahore High Court while she was
My
defending
God.
a blasphemy accused. I mean, but it took time and effort to change really social belief in what's right and wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
we need to do something similar about the environment. when it comes to the judiciary. Yes, capacity in the judicial amongst the judicial officers is necessary. Many of the lawyers who become judges are, they're dyed-in-the-wool lawyers. They're hardcore lawyers. They do revenue work, they do civil work, they do criminal work. They don't know what a waste treatment plant is or how people are affected by pollution. It's a language they're unfamiliar with. So capacity development at the judicial level is very, very important. So judges can identify and begin to see how the environment plays out in cases in front of them. I've been very lucky to teach law for many years now, and in the last 10 odd years, I've been able to, well, I'm very lucky, I've been offered to create spaces on environmental law. And
Hmm.
I find now that environmental law is not just a subject offered, now it's an HEC sort of subject as well. But that within the schools and universities I've taught in, environmental subjects are not just majors, they're also minors, there's whole streams of education. So
Wow.
there is now a huge body of not just students, but graduates that have emerged in the last 20, 25 years that have a better understanding of environmental law. And that will have an impact as well. So there are various things you can do, such as Asma did as well, Asma Jahangir did as well, to make that difference. But what I'm wistful about, especially with the climate crisis, is that we don't have 26 years. I mean, indeed, any
Hmm.
woman murdered in the name of honor didn't have time either, but we need to do this very quickly.
No, absolutely. And you rightly mentioned there's been a sea change when it comes to honor killings, but you'll still get that odd comment from a Supreme Court judge about victim shaming and things like that.
Good Lord, yes.
So you're very right. I mean, the problem is very much in front of us. We don't have the time for it. Rafi, do you feel that, legislation becomes one of the core elements for allowing this to happen? Because, when you have a legal environment, when you have legal rights enshrined in law, that you can then it's a lot easier to then invoke them in court as opposed to having to create the entire what is it, the jurisprudence from scratch at times on these issues.
Well, you see, again, the legal system, even now, it's individual parties adjudicating rights. If you want to introduce elements of environmental justice and climate justice, you'll have to do radical things that are unfamiliar to what the judiciary and its practice is now. You know, for example, if the River Indus were to be given legal character that could be picked up by local communities to protect their rights to the river, you know what that would mean? That would mean that a peasant farmer in Sindh, in Badin, for instance, could tell a landlord in Punjab whether or not he can grow sugar, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, just that one element, but just imagine the power structures at play here. It would never happen in the present judicial system, right? Because it's just not designed to do so. But the repercussions of what seems like a logical and environmentally friendly thing has very deep meaning in the political economy of things. Right? So, yes, legislation is crucial. You can redesign the system. You can move away from this sort of medieval, literally medieval adjudicatory system that we've inherited from the British and applied elements of Islam and then our own public interest litigation. You need to have that. But legislation, in its essence, represents the will of the people as exercised through their elected representatives in parliament and in provincial assemblies. So, all things being equal, in a perfect world, climate
Right.
legislation would come if there was a civil society demand for climate justice.
Hmm.
And right now, we're not there. Even though several hundred children died of pneumonia in Punjab 2 winters ago during the
Absolutely.
caretaker government setup. And, pneumonia is a respiratory illness, but it's exacerbated by air pollution. The fact that that air pollution was not on the agenda during the last elections in Punjab is very telling of where civil society and its understanding of its rights is. And that really is one of the major challenges to having effective climate legislation in the future.
Rafi, one of the issues that I've seen is that, whenever we talk about the environment, it's often people bring up the need to fix the economy, and first we do this. I remember working in KP on an Asan Karobar law, and one of the biggest challenges people had was don't give a bigger role to the environmental protection agencies, or this is a hindrance to being able to do business, and ease of doing business in the state. How do we get away from this myth, or at least this idea that environment or environmental concerns are bad for business?
Well, by realizing that this we aren't the first bunch of people to come across this problem.
That's true.
Environmental law has rolled out and faced difficulties in its implementation around the world.
Hmm.
Um, Environmental law really is a 20th century invention, and you start seeing beginnings of it in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And the first bit of it, what we now recognize as environmental law, and we still find it in our own penal code and elements of our tort law, criminal nuisance and things like that. If your neighbor pollutes your land, you can file an FIR against them. It's in the penal code. And the first generation of environmental law just did that. If there was pollution, it was dealt with by things like the penal code or tort law, and you shut the other entity down, or you charged it damages.
Hmm.
But applying that sort of practice at some point in the 20th century, it became apparent that this won't allow economic development. You can't keep on shutting down industry and expecting to have
Yeah.
economic development, even though that economic development causes environmental pollution. So that first generation of environmental law then evolved into what we call the second generation of environmental law, where a bunch of essentially economists in the global north suggested that there are varying forms of economic incentives that you can give business people to change their behavior. And
Hmm.
so the present application of most environmental law around the world operates on one of the principles called the polluter pays principle, which is essentially a polluter internalizing what are otherwise externalized environmental costs. I mean, if I'm an industry and I'm throwing water into the Hadiara drain, I don't care about how much it costs to the government of Punjab or the people of Punjab. It's not in my books.
Hmm.
So the idea that you internalize these costs through things like fines and incentives really became the second generation of environmental law, and it was to some degree successful. But you know what's interesting, and really to prove the point, was that in the 1980s, China discovered that compared to other economically developed countries, but OECD countries, it took China the consumption of far more resources to produce a unit of GDP compared to OECD countries. Now, when
Wow.
you're consuming resources to produce something, if you're inefficient in the consumption of resources, you produce pollution. If you can consume all of your resources in the process, you get more output and you're more efficient. So the
Hmm.
Chinese realized and connected the fact that the pollution that they were creating in the 1980s was also an economic inefficiency. And so in 1986, the Chinese introduced the first, and they called it the circular economy law. And they introduced what is now common in environmental science, the element of reducing, reusing, or recycling, the three R's, but in the industrial and economic process. This is the
Hmm.
third generation of economic law that recognize economic law development that recognizes that there is no such thing as economic development without a clean environment. And that, in fact,
Absolutely.
if you consume your resources more efficiently, you're not just producing more GDP, but you're also cleaning the air, you're also cleaning the water. And
Yeah.
so I don't look at it as a binary anymore. It's not about economic development on the other hand and environmental protection. You can't be a successful economically developed country without a clean environment. It comes as a
Hmm.
parcel now.
That's a brilliant way of looking at it. I really hope that that's something that we can really understand and internalize in Pakistan as well. Um, you mentioned in an interview last year, that we've had historic floods. They've displaced millions in Pakistan. Yet at the same time, we are buying fighter jets. We have food insecurity in Pakistan, and on the other hand, there are acres, millions of acres, which have been handed over for corporate farming. Um, you know, an agenda which is absent from Pakistan's climate policies. This is what you mentioned. Is the biggest obstacle to climate justice in Pakistan? Is it external, or are we, our own worst enemies in this regard?
No, it's very much a balance of both,
Okay.
right? because the global north has broken its promises under the UNFCCC of mitigating greenhouse gases or providing climate finance, the entire world has become insecure. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the fact that scientists are now telling us, there was a report out recently by a bunch of German scientists that more or less said that the 1.5 degree or limit that was the goal of the Paris Agreement, that's no longer alive, and that by 2050 we're going to probably breach 2 degrees centigrade global warming because of the increase in greenhouse gas production. Um, the consequences of that will be faced in Pakistan and
Of
in other
course.
countries around the world. And so that's happening at one level, and there's very little a Pakistani can do about that, right? But then at the domestic level, at the subnational level, there's plenty that we can do to reduce the impacts of climate change on us. Now, for example, there is a honeymoon hotel on the banks of the river Swat in Swat,
Mm-hmm.
and it collapsed in 2010 when it flooded up north. And it was rebuilt, and it collapsed again in 2022 when it flooded up north again. And it was
Absolutely.
rebuilt. Now, do you know that there is a KPK River Protection Ordinance of 2002 that prohibits absolutely any construction within 150 feet of the high level mark of a river? And
Really?
anything
Wow.
beyond that to 1,500 feet has to be regulated by approval. And that's from 2002. If that
Mm-hmm.
law had been implemented, a lot of infrastructure along the River Swat would have been protected. And yes, so good governance does make a difference, and it will
Absolutely.
make a difference. And yet we buy fighter jets, we put in underpasses and overpasses so that peri-urban housing estates can sustain their property values. We subsidize the elites, the sugar industry. We're doing all of these things. And at some level, I also believe that um, some of this lack of governance, there are many reasons for lack of governance in Pakistan. I just want to highlight one of them. It's perhaps not lack of governance, but naivete, in that the way our climate policies have been designed in Pakistan
Mm-hmm.
are under the assumption and good faith that international promises to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees will be met. And so that's the level of threat and then the level of preparation we've made for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I don't think our policies have prepared us for indeed the fact that the global north has failed in its promises, and we are much worse off than those plans intended us to be. So there's that failure of governance. There's also the naivety that we don't know how bad we have it right now.
Absolutely. Rafi, I just wanted to end, and this has been a fascinating discussion, but I really want to discuss one of the biggest issues that keeps up cropping up is smog. This is, many of us think this is a winter issue or this is a Lahore issue, but as you've rightly mentioned, this isn't one of those issues. It's I think the words you used were Kabul to Calcutta issue, and it's a year-long issue. This isn't simply, seasonal or something along those lines. And I think what you mean by a lot of this is that this is something to do with cross-boundary climate diplomacy, really. Really, the environment doesn't seem ripe, whether it's with our eastern neighbor or our western neighbor, to be honest, at the moment. But do you think there is a realistic framework on air quality cooperation that we can work on? What is the least common denominator, at least, that we can build up from? Because we all suffer from the same smog crisis in
Yeah.
that sense.
Well, I mean, I've called it a regional year-long public health emergency. And I mention this because in the October-November of 2024, there were these air pollution incidents over Punjab. And I
Hmm.
mean, like, AQI levels were well over 1,000, even in Multan, for example.
Wow.
And Multan doesn't have the population or industry to justify that sort of air pollution. Um, One of the things that the Environment Protection Agency did is it instituted a green measure whereby in Lahore's Simla Pahari, where the press club is, which is a
Hmm.
roundabout, there are 4 or 5 streets that emerge from there. There was a prohibition on rickshaws, extra parking, and the use of diesel generators, and also a ban on any charcoal tikka kebab shops. But if you had a look on satellite at that point in time of what the air pollution looked like, it was a Kabul to Calcutta problem. But the
Mm,
environment, if the Environment Protection Agency thinks that Lahore smog is a seasonal, regional, sorry, location specific issue, it will diagnose its problem with these sorts of initiatives.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
really, my point of saying that it's a regional, year-long public health emergency is trying to say you've got to diagnose this problem properly. If you diagnose it as a sort of seasonal issue that Lahore ke andar, it's only in Lahore, then you're going to do these sorts of silly things. You're not going to
Yeah.
properly be able to answer the problem. So that's why I really mentioned it. And air pollution requires not just subnational, but at some level, transboundary cooperation as well. Of course, it does. And I'm not the first to suggest it. It was in the 1990s that under the SAARC framework, there was a Malé Declaration on air pollution where South Asian countries agreed to cooperate to invest in air pollution. Well, they didn't invest. The United Nations invested in air pollution monitors across the region so that baseline reports could be made on air pollution and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But like all things SAARC, it hasn't gone very far. But solving air pollution is not just a Pakistan problem. It's also an India problem. It's
Hmm.
also an Afghanistan problem. It's a Nepal problem. It's a Bangladesh problem. Everyone has to be in the game. The contours of any sort of international treaties on this are extremely hazy. But it's my belief that states exist under the nation state model to protect the lives and property of their citizens. And if Islamabad and Delhi aren't concerned about the tens of millions of people that are going to die because of air pollution, then their leadership is not doing its job correctly, right?
It's not
And
responsive. It's not
so
understanding. Yeah.
I know the political reality that it's next to impossible to get Delhi and Islamabad, or even for that matter, Dhaka in a room together right now.
Hmm.
But there are other ways of getting this done. We live in the world of the internet and of social media. There are experts across the border, and I'm happy to report that we have social media networks, even WhatsApp groups, where there are people from across South Asia sharing information about air pollution. If
Wow.
that could somehow be institutionalized, if science or universities could collaborate on collecting and sharing data. I'm not saying they'll solve the diplomacy problems of Pakistan and India, but they'll be speaking in a language that's not necessarily Kashmir and terrorism. They'll be speaking
Yeah.
of a language that has to do with agricultural productivity, of human health, and perhaps that interaction can create the space necessary for Delhi and Islamabad to actually speak to each other. So I remain an optimist that regional cooperation is a way forward. It is one of many things that needs to be done to address this regional year-long public health emergency.
Absolutely. No, that's been very, very helpful. Rafi, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking out the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. Till next time.